Good afternoon, everybody. This is Father Tony Green here. I am one of the leaders in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team here at Ellis Medicine. And today we've got the privilege, honor of welcoming City Council President Marion Porterfield to speak with us. I just want to read a little bit of a bio that we put out in the announcement. Marion has served on the City Council since 2012. And is the first Black woman elected to be president of the council. Prior to entering politics, Marion was a community advocate. She ran a not-for-profit on J Street called Bountiful Closet, which supplied clothing to help women return to the workplace. So we invited Marion to come to talk about her experiences as a Black leader in the community, serving on the city council, and how on this Martin Luther King Day, maybe Martin Luther King may have inspired her or continues to inspire all of us in his legacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Marion, and you can feel free to introduce yourself further if you'd like. And we're so happy to welcome you. Thanks for joining us, Marion.
Oh, thank you, Father Tony, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I will tell you a little bit more about myself. As I said, my name is Marion Porterfield, and I grew up in Schenectady. I've been here since elementary school. Prior to getting on the council, I was very involved in the community, which is actually what led me to running for office to get on the council. I felt like there wasn't enough of a community voice on the council. I would spend a lot of time going to council meetings, advocating for various things, and I really didn't see as much happening that I thought should happen, and there wasn't as much involvement from the community. So I decided that I would get involved in the process. And before actually running, I did the work to help other people get elected. So that would also let me, I was able to learn what it took to get elected myself. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And also Father Tony talked about my community work. So yes, I worked in the community. That's something that my mother brought me to at a very young age. And she had me involved in Girl Scouts. I became a Girl Scout leader and volunteered at the church in any way to volunteer, because she always felt it was important for us to give back to our community. So that community involvement is something that was instilled in me at a very young age. And I just continued that into adulthood, and seeing things that were needed and using what the skills and talents that God has given me in order to help my community. So, as I said, I used to go to council meetings and advocate, and I said, there needs to be someone who sees the picture from both sides. So got involved with the party, learned how this thing works. And then I ran for office in 2012. Let me just tell you that, so people always say I'm the first Black president of the city council, first Black female president of the city council. I am the only Black female that's ever been elected to the city council. And often when I say that, people applaud, but I don't say it for applause. I say it so that people realize that we still have some work to do, because for all the years that the city council has been there, we still have only, I'm the first and the only. So I thought it was necessary to serve, and for a very long time, there were only two people of color, myself and John Mutu, who's Guyanese, that were on the city council for the 10 years. I was there alone for 1 year. Prior to me, I should make it clear, Joseph Allen served on the city council, and he was actually the person who broke that barrier. He was the very first African-American that served on the city council. So he actually opened the door for me and others who have since been elected to the city council. But for basically 10 years, 9 years, there were only two of us, people of color. In 2021, two young men that I actually recruited ran for city council. So we've increased that number. And so not only, it's really not just about them being African-American, but it's about them being connected to the community. One is extremely connected to the community. The other one's a younger person. He's only 31, and he's a military person. So for me, it was about diversifying also in ways of what people bring to the council. So we're very fortunate to have both those men to help serve and to work on the city council. I've enjoyed my time there. I thoroughly enjoy working with people in the community. And one thing I committed myself to once I got on city council was I would not forget about working in the community. So I've continued to do that as well. I think it's really important to stay connected so that you understand what the constituents, what their needs are, what their wants are, and that they find you accessible. Did you want me to talk about Martin Luther King and that connection right now, or do you want me to wait for questions?
Yeah, if you could go ahead and talk about it, and then we'll let people chime in and make it a conversation. Sure.
Okay. So in terms of this being Martin Luther King Day, it's a day that we celebrate. What I'd like to say is that it's a day we should observe, but what we should celebrate is what he stood for. And we should do that throughout the year. And not only talk about it when it comes to his birthday and, the day that the holiday that's named after him, because what he taught is really so much of what we need today. And if we're going to really just be frank about it, some of the things that he was working against have seemed to erupt in our world again today, which is, I find, very disheartening. But nonetheless, we still continue. And there are enough people in the world that together, if we recognize that we do have differences, but we have more in common than we have differences, and that we can work together for a common cause and do it in a very nonviolent way. We've seen some violence that comes with this when people have differences, but what Dr. King talked about was doing it in a very nonviolent way. And he also did it from the perspective of making sure that we do it with love in our heart and asking God for guidance and direction, which is something that I continually do. So I take from Dr. King what he, that he had to continually fight, and sometimes it got difficult. And I know, and sometimes it gets difficult for me as well. However, it is necessary work. And so I continue to do that because I remember and think about people like Dr. Martin Luther King, about Congressman John Lewis, and all of those folks who did the work and laid the groundwork for me and others to be able to be here today.
That's very inspiring, Marion, and to just know a little bit about your experience. This morning I was talking with somebody about Martin Luther King, and one of the actually in the announcement of one of our early morning meetings, that one of the most inspirational quotes from him is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
Yes.
And as you mentioned, it seems like we're still battling some of those things that Martin Luther King talked about. Yesterday in my sermon, I mentioned, don't often talk about my birth date, but I was born in 1965, and that was right in the midst of the civil rights movement. And I think as my life unfolded, that movement had a big impact on me, in just observing and also growing up in the South, because I grew up in Alabama. So could you talk a little bit about, from your early childhood, and kind of what were your experiences, and how have things changed, and what do we need to do now based on what you've just mentioned about Martin Luther King?
So my experiences, and let me just tell you, I've lived in various neighborhoods throughout the city of Schenectady. I've lived in Woodlawn, I've lived in Mount Pleasant, I currently reside in Hamilton Hill. So I've experienced living in various neighborhoods. And my experience is that for the most part, people are accepting of people just for who they are. However, I have experienced people, not accepting me just for who I am, but making judgments and treating me a certain way just because of what I look like and who I am. But what I really work to do is to try to surround myself with those people who, not the people who are basically toxic, but people who are very positive and work together. And we don't come to the table saying, you're different from me in this way, but rather, what do we have in common? What do we want to work together on? And, thinking about, again, how things are today, I feel like we really need to revisit some of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King taught and embraced, and realize that we really need that work that he was doing, we need to continue to do. and not forget it and not just talk about it in January on the 15th or 16th of January, but we really need to do that work because there are people that are experiencing the same things that we're experienced in the 60s during the civil rights movement. And that really should not be, especially when we're such a multicultural, very diverse community at this point. So we really should not be experiencing those things. I really feel that we should have really gotten past that.
Yes, absolutely. And I thank you for the work you're doing. And I know there's so many others out there doing work. I'll ask one more question and then I'll open it up to others to kind of chime in with questions. You know, since the time of Martin Luther King, and even here at Ellis, we've recently done a program to train all staff on what it means to have unconscious bias. And how can we mitigate that and be in touch with it to help us grow and be in better community with one another without like you talked about, that judgment just based on how someone looks, or maybe if we learn they're gay or lesbian or trans, or some of the other factors in their life. So, how do you think that is effective, and what more could we do when it comes to things like that, especially in healthcare? Like around training in unconscious bias, what more could we do to become more of a community without that bias?
So you first asked me if I thought it was helpful, and I think the answer is yes. I've taken it myself as part of something that the police department was doing, and they invited us to come in for a session to hear it. And let's just be clear that everyone has unconscious bias. We all do, and we may not know it until it's pointed out to us. And so people just assume when you talk about that, you're talking about particularly white people as it relates to people of color, but that is not necessarily the only implicit bias there is. So I think we all would benefit from doing that self-examination that comes with the workshops that are done, with the conversations that are had, that we could just look at us and just kind of take a look internally and say, how do I feel about that person because of whatever it is, how they're different from me? And so in terms of healthcare, first of all, I think it's extremely important that be something that is done and that people look at. I had a friend recently, I'll just tell you a story about my friend, who is a person of color and was seeing a practitioner who was not, and really felt that that person was judging them based on their ethnicity, and not only that, their economic status. So I mean, that I'm sure was not the practitioner's intent. However, language matters, and how you interact with a person matters. So there may be more than the implicit bias training, and there may be language that certainly offends people that we want to be careful that we use. And that's all of us. That's just not in medicine. So we should be careful with the language we use and references to a person's upbringing in terms of how it relates to, and without I want to really disclose this person's, information, but talking about their upbringing in relation to why they are the way they are in terms of their health. So I know that needs to be talked about. Like, for instance, diabetes runs in some communities a lot, and that's necessary to talk about it, but it's how you deliver that makes a difference as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Where there's not blame as you're presenting information to people.
Right.
Well, thank you for that. So I want to open it up now. Anybody out there, could some of you chime in and offer some questions, comments to Marion?
Hi, Marion. It's Paul Milton. I'll start.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you? I can't see you though, but I'm still seeing myself.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Well, maybe that's changing it.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for helping us out here today and sort of being part of this conversation. As Father Tony said, we've been working on this for, I don't know, it's sort of in a informal but more formal way in the last year or so about having a conversation. And one of the things that we've talked about is for folks to get kind of comfortable being a little bit more uncomfortable in that conversation. And I'm just wondering from your learning and perspective, is there any tidbits or advice for us? Because most of the people on this call here, many of them are leaders, how to step into that space to be a little bit more comfortable getting uncomfortable in a conversation, and particularly some of it may be sort of that unconscious bias that we all have, as you said, because I'm looking to help advance our culture here in it. We don't, like you said, we don't want this just to be the Martin Luther King Day, with all due respect to him.
Yes.
He had such an impact. It's all the time, every day, all year long. But I do think each of us in our own way has to find a way to get into that area to get a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I'm wondering how you respond to that or what your thoughts are.
So I would say, don't be afraid to ask a question if there's something you don't understand. And sometimes people make assumptions or don't want to ask because then they're like, well, will I offend them if they ask? But if you want to get it right, you have to ask. And also the other thing is, we can't assume that every person of color, even if they belong to the same ethnic group, speaks for everybody else in that ethnic group. So we can't make those assumptions. I find it interesting how sometimes people interact with me, and because I'm a woman of color, African American specifically, there's sometimes in they're greeting me, they greet me in such a way that they assume that that's how they should greet me. And for instance, I experience it pretty often. It's kind of interesting that that Caucasian women and men will often greet me in a way that they think that another Black person would greet me. And I find that kind of interesting. So that happens. So I would say, don't be afraid to ask the question. But the other thing is, if you hear someone else making someone else uncomfortable, then step into the conversation, because allies are help, and they're really necessary. So if you see someone else that's talking about someone, whether it's because they wear head coverings or because they're in some way different, and you're in the room, if we don't step into the conversation and say, hey, that's not appropriate, don't do that, you're making them feel a certain way, then we're kind of going along with it. So I know it's uncomfortable sometimes, but standing up for other people, as much as you would want someone to stand up for you if you're in the same situation, is what I would recommend that people do. And again, ask questions. Sit down and have one-on-one. It may not be a group thing because maybe you're not comfortable with that. But if you have a question, you're interested in knowing things, you can ask people.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, because it's what we're trying to encourage everyone to do in their sort of safe space of someone that they know,
right?
And to get a little bit of that courage up, as you said, to ask a question that you wouldn't normally, or as you said, if there's a conversation going on with others that you find it's important for you to step into and have the courage to do that,
right,
to advance the conversation. Well, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you.
We have a question that was sent in through the chat from Kelsey Munn Wilson. She says, hi, Marion. Thank you so much for being with us today. I was curious on your thoughts about how palatable MLK Jr. is because he was religious, fought with kindness most of the time, an educated man, when often racism should not and cannot be met with palatable responses.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Thank you. Yes. And sometimes it depends. Every person responds differently. And so most of the time he did, because that was his belief. And I have to agree with you that sometimes you have to be a little bit more assertive about it. And so that depends on the situation. And so with Dr. King, he was that, but then they have other leaders that weren't. And also there were people within his organization. So he may not have been the person, but there were people in his organization that weren't as, didn't treat things in the same way. So I think that what it is that you have a team of people, and that though he is the leader, just seemed to take everything in stride, and just whatever people did to him and all the racism that he faced, took it. But there were others who did not. So I don't believe we're going to change people and who they are. But I also don't think that we could address things with hate, because only love can conquer hate. So to try to come against that in a way with hate, it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to be two people or two groups approaching each other with hate. I do not believe that's the answer. Because darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that. So I believe in how Dr. Martin Luther King led. And as I said, there were other people who just couldn't take it anymore. They're like, we're not going along with that. But we have to keep in mind that if we start to, if there are people who are treating others in a hateful way, in a racist way, with xenophobia, whatever it is, but to combat that organization, that other individual with hate, is not going to be the answer. I believe that you have to help people to better understand, or if they're so toxic, just not have them around you. So yeah, I just believe that light is what puts out darkness, and not more darkness.
I just as somebody who, I've been involved with particularly the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender movement, and there has to be many different voices from many different perspectives. So I think of it in regard to, I was a young man coming into my own when HIV and AIDS hit the scene in the 80s. And you had people who were speaking from we need to move the Congress and other elected officials, and then you had the ACT UP group that went out and laid down in the middle of the street to make change. So you've got different ways of making movement, and depending on what issue you're addressing. Anybody else out there got a question you'd like to pose to Marion?
Hi, Marion. My name is Bill Potter. I'm one of the directors in human resources. Yeah. And with Paul, Father Tony, many of us on the call were on the DEI committee. Mm-hmm. I'm new to this area. I've only been here almost 18 years. Seems new, being you've grown up here. But how have you seen it improve or not improve when it comes to Schenectady? Because Schenectady's changed throughout your, it's grown then the 70s and then it's rebuilt. But how have you seen it improve or not for people of color? And if it's improved, why? And if it hasn't, why?
So it is showing some improvement, but not enough. In terms of it, I spoke about in terms of government. And so me being the first African-American woman on the council, and me and one other gentleman being there for 10 years. And then when the council did grow to having 4 people of color, it was met with such opposition. Literally, our campaign announcement was, we were marched on. So there's not enough acceptance of it. And also in terms of other leadership roles, we don't see enough people of color in those roles. So there's been improvement, but there's certainly a lot of room for more improvement and for just inclusiveness. And not just we're talking about government here, we're talking about medicine, but also in other leaderships and nonprofit organizations. People need to be able to see people that they can relate to in terms of that's something that they can achieve. So we definitely need to see more of that. And organizations that are led by people of color should be, when people are doing things and reaching out, they should reach out to those organizations as well to make sure that they're included as we all work together to improve the city. And you're right, it has improved. When I was growing up, it was one way, and then it went downhill. I remember when downtown was great when I was younger, and then it went downhill. And clearly we're back again. But if you think about it, can you think of, I don't know how much you know about downtown right now. Downtown, I think there's only one restaurant that's owned by, maybe 2, owned by people of color. So, there's many areas where we could improve. Sitting on boards, commissions, it's something that I really always talk to people about and advocate for. Get involved with your community. Of course, I speak from either community involvement or with government, which is also community. But get on boards, commissions, and all of that, and get in those leadership roles and be at those decision-making tables, because that's what it's going to take. So we do have some work to do. We have seen improvement. I will never say we haven't, but certainly there's more that can be done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kelsey typed in a question, what are those restaurants so we can support them? Is Tara's one of them?
Tara's Kitchen is there, and also Yaya's. Do you know Yaya's?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Our chaplains, I wasn't able to go, but some of our chaplains went there for a lunch one day.
Oh, okay.
They said it was great. So this is kind of a risky question. Okay. And I don't want it to devolve into politics, but it's pretty clear in the media lately that the city council, there's been some allegations of racism. Mm-hmm. And I think out of that, there was an agreement to do an anti or unconscious bias training. Uh-huh. So can you kind of comment a little bit on how are the workings with it? Because the city council is the leadership group for the city. Mm-hmm. Has it improved, or do you feel that there's some improvement when it comes to race relations? I'm not sure if that's the right term or not, but being able to work together beyond that.
So yeah, so we have. I think that we still are able to get things done, but clearly not as much as we could get done if these things weren't kind of like sidelining some conversations or getting and people working together on things. We are scheduled to do implicit bias training. We've been trying to get that moving for a while. It looks like it should happen next week, and because there was initially some level of resistance to that, where people felt that they didn't need that, and even if so, here's my answer to that. Even if it doesn't apply to you, then it doesn't matter. If you're like, if you go there like, yeah, no, I'm not that way. It doesn't apply to me. So at least you reassured yourself that it doesn't. So we have had some, I just hate to talk about it in that way, but race has come up more than once. And to me, it's indicative of what people feel. It's also indicative of what has happened at our national level. And so people feel that they're very comfortable to do and say certain things. And some people don't realize or think that what they're saying comes across, it doesn't mean they're a racist, but that it comes across race as racist, not the person, but what they're having to say. And sometimes people aren't aware of what other people interpret as being racist. So I believe that having that conversation and also we talk about how we stereotype people. And sometimes we stereotype people and we don't realize it, or it's just a stereotype that carries through and we just figure like, everybody says it anyway. So implicit bias training, you should recognize those things, that those things are within me, and then I'm saying those things, and maybe that's offensive to someone else, and maybe I should not approach that. So yes, the council has work to do. There's no question, but we are at this point where that is moving forward. And I believe it's quite possible. And so if we were able to work together as a council when there was the majority were not people of color, and there's now when the majority is people of color and there's a problem, then people can come to their own decision of why that is.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much from your perspective there. There's another question typed in from Kathleen Houlihan. Hi, Marion. Thank you for meeting with Ellis today. As a bedside registered nurse, what would you think the most important things would be to do or to improve on to be more open to diversity, health equity, and inclusion with our populations? Thank you. Your feedback is important to us.
So, my mother's passed away almost 2 years ago now, but we used to have a woman that came to the house to see her. And so she was a registered nurse as well. So I don't think that in that case, it really mattered what race she was. So as long as you're accepting or understanding of maybe if their culture is different than yours, there are some cultural norms. Like there's specific there are specific, I was going to say religions, but groups who, like, coming into their house, you can't wear your shoes. There are some that you can't, like a man won't touch a woman, or if you're a healthcare provider, that they would want a person of the same gender to treat them. So those are the kind of things that we need to be aware of. And just, I think this goes across all spectrums, regardless who you are. If when you're working with someone, if you need to touch them in a certain way and you're not sure, to ask them if is it okay for me to touch you here. So maybe things you don't normally think about because we just go about doing our job. But those things that we may not know culturally, that's not something that you should do.
And just from a chaplain's perspective, Marion, I've learned over my years that there are many different ways of grieving when it comes to any kind of loss or health challenge, where it's helpful to stand back, or, like you said, ask. It's helpful to ask. And some people, some communities grieve more openly and more verbally than others. It depends on where we come from.
Yes, definitely.
Anybody else out there have questions for Marion? Comments?
I do.
Yeah, Rich.
Come on.
Hi, Rich.
Hi, Marion. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. I've been admiring you in the paper lately. I have two questions. I'll ask them one at a time. Answer, then I'll ask the second. What is the status of the Black Lives Matter on the street? I'll just share my opinion of it. I think it should stay there. I think it should be maintained as it wears down until folks in Schenectady County understand what that statement means.
So the status is, there were people who were coming to the city council meeting and saying, hey, we need to take that. First, it started with, we need to paint over that. And then when they realized that really wasn't getting any traction, they said, well, we need to be able to paint something else on the other side. So the status is that the mayor has said that he will not, not paint over it. That's not going to happen. And to your other point, it hasn't been updated or, repainted. So that's something, I guess, that we'll have to ask about and see if that can happen, which will cause more of a uproar, I'm sure. But yeah.
My second question revolves around Martin Luther King identifying the three evils: racism, economic exploitation, and war. And I was honored to preach in the city of Rome yesterday, and for their celebration. And the statement that stood out to me that Martin Luther King made was that when our country goes to war, that from his perception, it spiritually moved people not to see the pain and suffering right in front of us. And as somebody that's been anti-war his entire adult life, and as I know that all politics are local. When we read about the gun violence in Schenectady, when I read about the continuing out of control gun violence in the Cornhill neighborhood of Utica, where the church is that I pastor. How could you see us going forward all the way down to the local level, up to the federal level, in creating an anti-war movement. If we're prepared to embrace that this continuing war making abroad is affecting us spiritually at home.
Okay, so I really don't know where we would start with the anti-war movement, quite frankly, because there are people who believe that war is just the answer, and then that's how we get there. Clearly, it's not. So I believe that it would take people who believe that war is not the answer, and that's to work towards that, and to also point out, as you have, how going to war impacts our country in a very negative way. So I'd have to give that more thought, quite frankly, and sit with some thought partners on how we could accomplish that. Absolutely.
Amen.
All right. And I should have called you Reverend Moran. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So
right.
I do want to say, oh, is there someone else? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I do want to say that in terms of kind of what Reverend Richard said, that how we need to come together spiritually during COVID, which was a very difficult time for our entire country. And thank you, Father Tony, for allowing us to come to Ellis. We recognized that people were in pain and people were hurting and people were isolated. So we came together, it was some initiative that I started to come together to actually go to various locations. When we came to Ellis Hospital, people prayed for the people there. We went to the CDTA to, the people who still had to work. So I think that it's important that we recognize when people are hurting and that we not do more to hurt them. So in talking about, Martin Luther King, and also about, the racism and the pain that our country has gone through and is still going through, I think it's each of us, it's incumbent upon us to try not to be a part of that hurt, but to instead be a part of that healing, because it's possible. Yeah. It's possible.
Yeah.
So,
and I'll add to that, Marion, that was very much appreciated for you to offer, and other spiritual leaders and groups that came and prayed on our lawn. And there was one group that came and did a little concert, even like right on the lawn, religious music, and it drew people out. And then I'll also add that after the George Floyd murder, Paul Milton, as our leader, invited us to go out on the lawn and take a knee for, help me remember how long it was, 9 minutes?
Yes, 9 minutes, and I can't remember the seconds. I think 28, but I'm not really sure. Yes. And so
we had a large group of, the lawn was full of people from Ellis, showing, in our diversity and our support, and that, we want to make a difference, even if it is, we know prayer, thoughts and prayers just aren't enough sometimes. And so we have to show somehow that we want to make a difference.
Right. And I think it's, I believe, Kelsey's point earlier. So we all, well, I won't say we all, but I'll say that I'm a woman of faith, but the Bible also said that faith without works is dead. So we can have the faith, but we got to do the work. We got to recognize that there's work to be done. And I want to appreciate you. I didn't know about that. I want to appreciate Paul for leading that within the employees at Ellis, and for all of the people that participated, because it's very important for communities that are impacted by that we have allies who say this is not acceptable. So thank you for that.
Okay, and anybody else have questions, comments?
Just one question, maybe, Marion. We're trying to work with the educational systems in the area here, the Schenectady, particularly Schenectady High School and the community college. are you aware of what they're doing here and any kind of ideas for us to continue to work with them? I mean, it's part of kind of the evolution with the next generation, obviously, and getting them involved in this in a very productive way. Anything that you hear about or advice for us?
So in terms of in the medical or
no, just in general, just I think of all the young kids, the young people that are out there.
Yes.
And we're a large employer and trying to connect with them.
You certainly are. So first of all, let me tell you, thank you for that question, because I really believe in succession planning, because we need to get young people in place, because we're not always going to be here. So I would recently I heard from the sheriff's department, because I talked to him about like an explorer program. So, and I know back in the day, they used to have candy stripers. They don't have those anymore. But if there's a youth program or some way that you can bring young people in to introduce them, or even if there's something that where someone could go into the schools to introduce students to looking at medicine for a career, whether it be a doctor or a nurse.
We're doing that, but I'm trying to layer in sort of the kind of the Martin Luther King thing, sort of the character, the culture of our community with DEI with them, because we are reaching out to them now, purely from kind of an employment perspective, but I don't think we've really woven this in.
Oh, okay. Well, from what I can see, actually being a patient there sometimes, I do see that you have a diverse staff. So I think it's important in highlighting that, whether you do it by, social media, whether you do it by, sending a video to school, however you choose to do it, whether you do it by some of those individuals being the ones who, when people come to be interviewed, if that's what we're talking about, they don't have to be the person that interviews them, because they may not necessarily be HR, but you can introduce them to someone who is from another diverse background, where they could say, hey, there's room for me here because I see this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. You're
welcome. Because I'll tell you another story, because I have lots of stories. When this was many years ago, but and why I brought up maybe have the video. I was at a meeting, and this particular group, I'm not going to name them, did a video about school to work. And so I'm the only person of color in the room, and I watched the video. And then after I finished, I said, did anyone notice anything missing in that video? And nothing was missing for anyone. What was missing was the only person of color in that video was someone who was standing in the room, and they scanned past that person and did not include them as like, this person works here as well. So we're talking about school to work. So how about a person of color, a young person of color, seeing that and not seeing themselves reflected, except to be passed by, just panned in the shot? So that's why it's important, because people need to see themselves reflected and understand that there's room for me here. So I just wanted to tell you how I came to think of that, because I experienced that.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very good. Very good point. Anybody else before we begin to wrap it up? Well, I am so grateful, Marion. I've got a lot to ponder now, and I'm sure everybody else does on the call, giving us some good food for thought. And, we wish you all the best in all that you're doing, and thank you for all you're doing to keep the conversation going, as Paul talks about, and giving us an opportunity to ask some of these questions, and from your perspective as a leader. So we thank you greatly. Got people typing in, thank you. There's one person, great program, thank you, Marion. And thanks to the DEI committee for putting it together. And thanks everybody for chiming in.
Right. And I want to thank you, Father Tony, and the DEI committee for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity. Always open to conversation. I know I owe a visit out there, and I will be making that. So thanks for everything that you do. And thank you for thinking it's important enough to talk about. I appreciate that.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's our way to really also sort of honor Dr. King and what he did to recognize him. So thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Blessings,
Enjoy the
Marion.
rest of
Blessings.
your day. Thank
Take
you
care.
so much. All right, take care.